back to my YouTube channel. If you're new here, then my name is Katie. I'm a mixed media sketchbook artist, and today's video is part 2 of my mini mixed media series. So I really recommend watching part 1, which I'll link up in the cards and down below. That was last week's video, but I think it was a really good introduction to mixed media, and I talk a lot in that one about layering, choice, different mediums and colours as well. So in today's video, which is part 2, we're going to be talking about minimizing overwhelm, how to pick your supplies when you've got this much to choose from, as well as how to stop overworking and muddying your colours. We'll also talk about choosing mid, light and dark tones, as well as creating contrast and depth in your work, and then we'll finish with how to fix it in your sketchbook so it doesn't transfer onto your pages. So I hope you find this video helpful, whether you're a beginner or you're a mixed media artist already, and hopefully you'll pick up some techniques and some good little tips and tricks. So without further ado, let's get on with part 2. So we're going to start with how to not overwork something. We're going to continue this page which I started in part 1, where I've laid down my base layers. And I want to talk about how to avoid muddying up your work and when to stop. My biggest advice is to constantly sort of look back and step back from your work. The biggest question to ask yourself is if it achieves what you want it to achieve. Does it show that reference as you feel like it should? Does it include everything that you wanted? Maybe you want it to have a really warm, comforting vibe. If it does that already, then you can step away. If it feels finished in your head and you feel like you're just adding to it just for the sake of it, then step back. But having those constant check-ins and looking at your work and seeing if it does answer those questions, I think is really important as an artist. In terms of not overworking or muddying up your work, that is really tricky, and I think it does come with practice. But for example, I feel like this one might be going a little bit too far the other way, and I want to show you what happens when we continue adding and adding and adding. So one of the big things to think about to stop your work from getting muddy is to wait for your layers to dry. If I put on some green here and I smush that around as if that's my green layer, so I'll just pop that on top there, and then I realise I want to darken it up, so then I'll come in with another colour. So I've just grabbed a phthalo blue, so I'll add that on top as well. And I just keep mixing, and then I'll come in with something else. It can really start to get really dirty and messy quite quickly. So this is starting to feel like I'm covering up all those layers I've put underneath, and I really don't want that. So I would stop and just give it a minute. Obviously, if I continue adding and adding, then it will start to really dirty up this artwork and really start to dirty up my colours. So at the moment, I still feel like there is a distinction between this blue. If I then added on some red or this burnt sienna that I've got to hand, it will really start to dirty up this whole piece and take away some of the lightness that was behind. So I'm deliberately trying not to go over some of this lightness so you can see the difference. But it makes a big change to the feeling of it. So I've lost that lightness that there was before because I kept adding and adding. And I think if I had stopped and just had a think before I added it on, it would have helped me to sort of not go that far. Obviously we've done it deliberately today, but you can see how it's starting to get really dirty and muddy, and that wasn't the vibe I wanted. Obviously it might be what you want if you're doing maybe a really dark forest scene, but for me I wanted it to be light and bright, and I perhaps have gone too far with that. If you have gone too far, it can be difficult to take it away because generally you'll be adding more and more on top, and this is still wet, but I do find that white near colours are really helpful for going over things and just bringing out a bit of light colour. So as I said, this is still wet, but this is working a little bit in adding some of that light tone back and just sort of saving it a little bit. But sometimes it's best to just turn the page and start again. Absolutely no problem with that. I think it's really important as an artist to know when to walk away from something, and it's okay to create work you don't like. It's part of being an artist and completely normal, so don't feel of it as a failure because it isn't. It's just a stepping stone to your next piece. So when it comes to overwhelm, obviously I have a lot of mediums here, and I totally understand that it can be a little bit daunting of knowing what to use. So start with one. So start with a layer of gouache and then see where you go from there. Start with one and then start adding, rather than being like, I want to use all of these things today in one piece. do it slowly and see what it needs, and it will also depend on the colours that you add. So maybe you want to add in a touch of sky, so we'll come in with some pastel because I know it will go over what I've already put down. And I might not have been planning on using pastel, but I know it will work with the mediums I've got. So starting with that one medium, so here we've got watercolour, we can then add on top of that. We can add on watercolour pencils, we can add on pastels, we can add on acrylic, whatever we fancy. But by having that base, it really lays the foundations for adding on top. So I didn't know what I would be adding onto this, but I know a lot of mediums will work over watercolour, so I know that a lot of things will layer nicely on top. But I didn't know at first, so it really does depend on how you're feeling, what you're drawing as well. So perhaps you're doing an image that's quite simple, you probably won't want to add loads of different mediums. But I'm just going to play around here with adding on some things on top. So this is a wet dough and intense. Maybe I'll be doing a little seascape picture. And just start to merge some of these colours. I'll come in with some near colour. So already we've got three different mediums already on here, and it's just going with the flow and seeing what works. We can add on even more, we can add on some brush pens. So if I grab this one as well and just start blending that in. But by starting with that base and then adding on top of it, it feels less overwhelming, it just feels more natural. And I think that natural approach really does show in the work, rather than it being like really try hard of trying to add in all these different things. I think it's really normal for things to evolve as you're creating, and I think that's really important as well, to play with that evolution in your artwork and see what works. So we're also adding in some near colour there, and we're probably there for that. So if I step back and see what we've got, if I just blend that in, it is getting quite dark, so I don't want to add on too much more, but I feel like maybe a bit of dark indigo in this corner will work really well, just to add in that depth down here in the corner. So quite a lot of mediums on this one, but it didn't feel too overwhelming because it happened slowly. So if you are feeling overwhelmed, pick one or maybe even two if you're wanting to push yourself, and then slowly add to it. So you can put down your gouache layer or your acrylic layer and then start adding on your neo colours and then build it up slowly. You'll also find that there will be materials that you'll absolutely love using and you'll reach for all of the time. And for me, that's like my comfort zone with neo colours. I absolutely love using those. And that's just come from working a lot over the last few years of trying different mediums and seeing what I prefer. And for me, gouache definitely does that. So it will depend on what you prefer, but you won't know until you create. And so I always just recommend having a play and just creating anyway. And I'm going to stop there. So I did just add in some acrylic and I really like the way that that looks. So it's kind of like an abstract sea. But for me, that's how I don't get overwhelmed, and it will depend on the day on what I fancy using. So as I said in part one, I might fancy using acrylic and going bigger, and for me, I would use acrylic for that. If I'm working big, it's a lot more affordable than using gouache, which is very expensive for those little tubes. So if I'm working on something really big like A3, this wouldn't be the medium I would reach for. So it would depend on that, but also how I feel. So depending on how you feel will depend on the mediums that you want to reach for, and I really recommend just going with your gut. So next up, we're going to talk a little bit more about colours. So again, I think this is very much a thing that you can practice and it does come naturally, but I would recommend looking at colour wheels and learning about colour theory. You don't have to start there, but I think it is a really good base if you're trying to work out what colours go together, and it does help when you're mixing. So for example, if I want to mix a really dark green, I wouldn't mix black and green. For me, I prefer to mix it with brown. So say I want to add on some green here. If I just get some watercolour on top, if I want it to be dark, I'll actually add in and mix in a brown. And mixing that in with the green will create this totally different shade. And it's the same for if I'm adding on some acrylic ink. So we've got a little bit of green here. And perhaps it's not the green I want. For me, I would then add in some red. And they're opposite in the colour wheel, so I know that it will create and sort of neutralise, so I can mix that in and it creates more of a browny green. So it will depend on obviously how much you add in, but I definitely recommend doing one of those colour charts. I think they're really useful of seeing how your colours mix and just playing around with your colours. So for me, I do have set colours that I know I love to use. So I don't really think about colour palettes as much as I used to because I've got that sort of groundwork made already where I know I've got colours that will work together. So there's certainly some greens I love to mix up using cadmium yellow and oxide chromium of green, and that's my favourite. I also really love this tone of blue, which is like cobalt blue, so you'll see that a lot in my work, and I think having those colours and the colour palette that you know you love is also really helpful when you are coming to it, especially if you're on a day where things feel really difficult. Reaching for those colours you've already tried and tested and know work is quite a nice way to create without having that extra brain power of thinking about it. So I also really enjoy the combination of putting pinks with a lot of my greens, and again that's come from practice and seeing what works. I really love using olive green, so I know all of these colours will go together. And I'm just playing around on top of these wet mediums just to see the textures that come through. But a lot of my work is playful and just trying things out. And it's the same with colour. So here I've got a light blue, maybe I want to add in a purple and see how that works. So more of the analogous colours where they sit together on the colour wheel, so the blues and the purples. So I know that that would work too. But it depends on what you're drawing, obviously, to what you want to create. This pink that I've added here with the greens, I wouldn't normally put, but I really like the way that works. I would usually pick this sort of pastel salmon pink to go with my greens, but I really like the pop of brighter pink and magenta that this has added to the greens. So that's really nice. And again, that's just come from play and trying different things out. Picking dark, mid and light tones was another question that I had, and that is a whole video on itself as well. But for me, I will work on top of what I've got, and it will again depend on the reference that I'm using or what I want to draw. It's kind of hard to explain how I pick it because it will depend on what you're drawing, but say I want to pick a light, mid and dark tone. For my lightest, I would pick maybe a lemon yellow, so we've got that there, and then a mid, so maybe an olive green, and then my dark would be the darkest tone of that, so I really enjoy using dark indigo as my dark tone, so that would be a dark, a mid and a light. But this could be your dark if you pick a lighter colour to that, so that could be our dark. Then we pick a mid, so perhaps an olive, and then the lemon yellow could still be our lightest, or we could go with maybe this flesh colour. So you can see there we've got a light, mid and dark, and then we can continue add to it. We can add another dark, we can add in another mid-tone, we can add in a completely different contrast colour, but to me that's still mid. So just playing around with colours, and I find that having a dark tone to go on top of a lot of your work is really helpful. So for me, I use this for details, so I can add in like details on top of this. Obviously this is still wet, so not really a good example, but I know that this will work on top of whatever I've got. This is the dark indigo, it's probably my most used dark tone, and I love using that on top of whatever I've put down, so I could use it for line work here. That's over a very light tone, so of course that would work, but it would also work on top of some of this as well, and I just find that's a really versatile colour. I'm just going to add in some light tones here as well, just to add in a bit of colour on this little scene. And that creates really good contrast. So creating depth is something I'm not really going to cover in this video. Again, as a whole different art lesson, I feel like. And I am doing very, very fast whistle-stop tours of all of these subjects. But for contrast, again, using that really dark tone really helps. So for this one, I've probably got my dark tone. I won't want to muddy this up by adding in a black or a darker tone on top of this really dark green brown, but I can come in with a mid-tone or light tone. So I can come in with my pink. This is still quite wet, so this paper is definitely taking a bit of a battering. You can see it's coming through on the other side, but maybe I'll swap that for a pastel, perhaps a light blue pastel, would layer on top really nicely. So I'm getting that contrast from adding in a light tone instead of a dark tone. So generally when you think of contrast, you'll be putting in a darker tone. So perhaps this needs a bit more contrast, so I'll come in with my dark indigo and just go on top, just to add in a bit of contrast for some of the background there. But with this one I've already got my dark tone in there, so I can come in with a lighter tone to add that contrast that's already there. So I think that works quite nicely. And so adding contrast doesn't have to be another dark colour. It can be looking at what you've got and seeing where you want that lightness. So perhaps I want a bit more lightness on the sky. So again, I can come in with that pastel and add that on. And maybe that's not light enough. A lot of this is mid-tone at the moment, so maybe I'll want to lighten things up and come in with a white. So I'm coming in with an acrylic white here. This is quite a dirty brush, but we'll see what we can create and just maybe add in some of these fluffy clouds. And again, we've automatically created that contrast between some of these darker colours and a lighter sky. So that is, I have got very dirty water, but you can kind of see there how it adds that contrast of the white against some of the midtones I already had. And I did cover up some of that blue, so maybe we'll just add that in. And I think that creates quite a nice little scene there. So yeah, we can continue, like we could even add on a white on top of that, but you can build up your contrast by looking at what you've got and either adding in a lighter tone or a darker tone. Somebody asked me what I would avoid, and I really don't know that there is anything I'd say avoid, because I think to play and to try out lots of different things, you're going to learn a lot of lessons, and I don't know that me just telling you what to avoid will help you with your artistic journey. There's no art materials that I say I'd avoid, because we all work so differently and we all work in different ways. So what maybe I don't like, you might love, and I really recommend trying things out. Buying things open stock so you can try a specific watercolour pencil brand or a specific pastel and seeing if you like that before then buying more of them or a multi-pack. I definitely recommend starting small and then working your way out rather than buying a whole load of multi-packs. So I would say avoid going straight into a multi-pack for a medium you've never tried before. But other than that, I would say just go for it and just have fun and just see what you learn along the way. So the last thing I want to address is talking about sealing your work and stopping it from transferring. So you'll see in a lot of my sketchbooks that I have got little scrap bits of paper. So I cut these from greaseproof paper, and I've also got just scrap printer paper here as well. And I generally have 4 or 5 of these in my sketchbook that I'll move throughout the book. And I find that works really well because then it transfers onto the paper rather than the artwork. So if I've got an example here, you can see where some of the graphite has started to transfer onto this, but it didn't transfer onto the artwork because this is in the middle. So obviously if this was on the other side here, oh, here's a good example. So you can see where I've been pressing quite hard on this side, it would make some of the pencil on here go onto here if this wasn't here. But you can see how grubby this is getting, so perhaps I need to swap it out for a cleaner sheet when I move it along my paper. But it really helps keep my artwork cleaner, and that's my big secret, which isn't a secret at all because I know a lot of artists do this. But just having scrap bits of paper in between my pages helps to keep my sketchbook quite clean. Obviously it's not perfect, sometimes I forget to put in those pieces of paper, but I do find it helps. And I personally don't like using fixative in my work. I prefer to just use scrap paper, and a sketchbook is a working piece, so I'm not too worried if it gets ratty and dirty. But if you did want to fix your work, then you can use spray fixatives. So I have tried ones from Jackson's, I've used a pastel fixative. If I'm using oil pastels, then I will use fixative. I have used oil pastels in here. So this one where I have just still got this here, but I did fix this, and so the oil pastel isn't coming up anymore, and I used Jackson's spray fixative for that. I've also got one from Sennelier, but I prefer not to have the really strong smell of fixative in my sketchbooks because I do work in these quite often. for me, I prefer to just keep them with the pieces of paper and not to smell that strong odour whilst I'm creating. But if you are working with pastels, and like the other day when I created this scene with the graphite, I will fix this so I can still have, I don't have a clean finger, let's see. Yeah, that's just come up from this paper. So although I will put in a scrap piece of paper, I think this will really benefit from being fixed just because it's such a loose pigment. So again, it does depend on your mediums. Mostly with the stuff that I use, it doesn't transfer too much. But if it's something like soft pastel or oil pastel, then I would probably spray it. And if you are sending it out for originals, if you're selling work, then I definitely recommend spraying for that as well, which also helps keep the artwork staying as it is and helps the longevity of it for your buyer. So I really hope that's helped. This one is slightly shorter than the first one, but I hope that that's covered a few extra things. So talking about overwork, we also talked about colour palettes and picking different tones. But I hope that's been helpful in seeing how I use mixed media and some of my approach in a really general way to how I usually would share on YouTube, where I show you my process. This has definitely been more generalised, but I really hope it's been helpful. I really wouldn't be able to create videos like this without the financial support from my patrons, so a big thank you to them for allowing me to do this and continue my YouTube journey. I hope you found this helpful. Do let me know in the comments what you think and if you enjoyed this little mini series, and I hope you have a creative week ahead. I will speak to you all really soon in my next YouTube video. See you later!